For American troops stationed in the Pacific during World War II, not much felt like home, but each day they got a little slice of life in the States, courtesy of the popular Japanese radio host they branded Tokyo Rose.
Greetings, everybody. This is your number one enemy.
The show was called The 0 Hour and mixed popular American music with messages from Japanese propagandists, hoping to make their American military audience long for home and abandon the fight.
Well, thank you. That's all for now, enemies, but there'll be more of the same tomorrow night.
When the war ended and American occupation forces began rounding up war criminals and traitors, no prize was greater than finding Tokyo Rose. But despite public opinion, the woman known as Tokyo Rose was not a traitor, but a loyal American. Her name was Iva Toguri, and her segment of the 0 Hour was called Music for You, and was purely entertainment. Iva was born in Los Angeles, California, and raised fully American. In July of 1941, she traveled to Japan to visit a sick relative. As tensions rose between the U.S. and Japan, Iva tried to return home, but her passport application was still delayed at the State Department when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. With the U.S. and Japan at war, Iva Toguri was trapped in Japan. Iva was soon contacted by the Japanese secret police, which ordered her to renounce her American citizenship. She refused. In 1943, she was hired as a typist at Radio Tokyo. At that time, Radio Tokyo had just begun broadcasting 0 Hour, which was produced by a group of Allied POWs and Japanese-American hosts. In November of 1943, Toguri was added as a host, using the moniker Orphan Anne on air. She chose that name because she felt like an orphan in Japan. But our troops called her Tokyo Rose. As host, Iva actually helped the U.S. military. The troops loved her corny narrations and found the popular songs she played entertaining. When the war ended, American occupation authorities began rounding up war criminals and American expatriates for trial. Because she had refused to renounce her citizenship, Iva was still subject to U.S. law throughout her time at Radio Tokyo. That allowed prosecutors to investigate her for treason. Iva was quickly arrested and brought back to the U.S. in 1948. She was then charged with 8 counts of treason and was convicted on 1 count, specifically for mentioning the loss of American ships. No recording of this broadcast exists, and the accusation was never proved. Nevertheless, Iva was sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined $10,000. Iva spent 6 years and 2 months in prison and was paroled in January of 1956. 20 years later, Chicago Tribune reporter Ron Yates picked up on her story and discovered that 2 prosecution witnesses had perjured themselves. Not only that, but they had been forced to do so by U.S. authorities on the threat of being tried for treason themselves. Further investigations and a feature on 60 Minutes brought Tokyo Rose back into the limelight. As word of this miscarriage of justice spread, momentum began to build for a presidential pardon. On January 19, 1977, President Gerald Ford formally and unconditionally pardoned Iva Toguri, restoring her citizenship which had been stripped away upon her conviction. In 2005, the American Veterans Center directors decided her story of perseverance and patriotism was worth remembering. In early 2006, AVC President Jim Roberts honored Toguri with the AVC's Edward J. Herlihy Citizenship Award. An emotional Iva Toguri later said that receiving the award was the most memorable moment in her life. Never before, even with her pardon, had she been so honored. Sadly, she died just 8 months later, on September 26, 2006. Iva Toguri was always a proud and loyal American. She was wrongly convicted by our government and suffered because of that for years. But ultimately, that same government set the record straight, and now history needs to remember her as the patriot she was.